this segment does not sort of reflect the title of that song, No Fun, because it should be a fun one. And the Stooges bio is an interesting one. Before I get into it, though, guys, familiarity with the Stooges coming into this segment. Matt?
Certainly aware of them. I think I have heard this album here and there, but not terribly familiar with it. I did know I Want to Be Your Dog because it was another cover from Uncle Tupelo. That we talked about them earlier. I first heard Effigy by Creedence from Uncle Tupelo, and the difference between their cover of that song and their cover of I Want to Be Your Dog is their cover of this song here. I Want to Be Your Dog is very different than the Stooges version. So it's kind of
as I would imagine,
interesting country twang kind of thing going on there, which this Stooges version certainly isn't. But other than that, aside from like a listen here or there of this record, not a whole lot. So this was relatively new for me.
Gotcha. Josh, how about you?
I am familiar. I own this album, and I've listened to Raw Power on more than one occasion. Mm-hmm. But it's been a while since I listened to this, and with fresh ears and some CTS context, I'm ready for my mind to be blown.
There we go. And just for reference, Raw Power is the third and final studio album by the Stooges in the early 70s. And that's got quite the origin story, too, that involves a man by the name of David Bowie. And speaking of origin stories, Matt, let's take it back, because Josh wasn't here for it, and let's see how good your memory is.
All right.
How did we bring up the Stooges before in perhaps a previous bonus episode? Perhaps say like a cleaning of the attic.
Yes.
Should I insert some Jeopardy music here?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to come up with this. Does it have to do with that 16 song, the Christine 16 or whatever?
No, that is not. It has to do with the MC5, if that jogs your memory at all.
From Detroit. Stooges are from
They're
Detroit.
both from Detroit. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They're both from Detroit.
No. I'm not recalling.
So we'll work backwards a little bit in the origin story here, but basically the Stooges were signed by the record company during a visit to sign the MC5, and the record label actually ended up signing both acts. The act went to go, record producer went to go see the MC5, and they said, Wayne Kramer said, hey, there's this band that's open for us called the Stooges. You should check them out too. And they made it a 2-for-1 deal. And so that is how the Stooges were signed to their first major label record contract. Because they were opening for the MC5 in Detroit. So, all right. So I think the first thing about this album that pretty much everybody mentions, and I don't think this is a controversial opinion, but you could feel free to challenge this. We've listened to a lot of stuff from the late 60s. The Stooges did not sound like much coming out of 1969, I would say. Pretty much if they're compared to anybody in the 60s, they're compared to sort of garage rock bands like the Troggs, for those that are familiar with that band. You might know
that
them
Wild
from
Thing?
Wild Thing and stuff like that, yes. But that's not an exact fit by any means. Sometimes they also get lumped with the Velvet Underground, I think due to the avant-garde presentation on the stage of the Stooges we'll get into, certainly not the sound of it. And John Cale from the Velvet Underground was actually the producer of this album. And actually, his production was much maligned for failing to sort of capture the Stooges' vitality, a lot of people found. But what you'll learn about this album is there is a ton of fuzz tone and wah-wah sound effects on the guitar lead. And wah-wah is exactly what it sounds like. It's a wah-wah sound caused by using the pedal and just different distortion when playing. And the fuzz tone is the sound of an enveloping guitar, the guitar tone. And it's very noticeable when you listen to this and later in punk music as well. The Stooges, for those that don't know, you've got Iggy, soon to be known as Pop, but at this point he was known as Iggy Stooge, is the lead singer. Dave Alexander on bass, and then the Ashton brothers, Scott on the drums, and then Ron Ashton on the guitar. This album came out on August 5th, 1969. Very quick origin story. They all grew up in Michigan. Iggy Pop patterned himself in many ways as a drummer. He loved a lot of drummers growing up, and then by his own account, there are two things that caused him to form a band. One is going to see the Doors in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Jim Morrison was a definite influence for him in terms of stage presentation, albeit the way it was brought to the stage by Iggy Pop was very different in many ways than Jim Morrison, but they both shared sort of a desire to a sexual energy that they brought to the stage, albeit in very different ways. So he credits that. And the other is he actually went to New York City and he met up with an all-female band from Princeton, New Jersey. I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, so Princeton's right in my neck of the woods from where I grew up. And basically he went to go see their gig and he was inspired and he said, hey, if they can do it as a group of women in 1967, why can't I do it? So he puts together the band that we just talked about, and they begin touring immediately. They play a house party for their first show in 1967, and then they, pretty much everywhere you read, some variation of they toured relentlessly for the next year. They were not well received by most people as a live act. They were considered to be, by most serious rock fans, either a novelty act or sort of gross. And part of that is because Iggy Pop on stage was known for his theatrics, almost always shirtless, spreading various substances all over himself, cutting himself and bleeding on the stage. The sound itself was sort of grimy and unrefined. And so they had a cult audience, but they weren't really considered to be all that artistically credible. That would continue in terms of how they were reviewed throughout the late 60s and 70s. Professional rock critic types did not love the Stooges, although they would often, it's interesting, they would often say that they enjoyed the album while then talking about how awful it was in terms of, the prehistoric riffs and, simplicity and stuff like that. There was one holdout, the wonderfully named and pretty much becoming my favorite critic, because not only is he right in hindsight a lot, but you just can't have a better critic name, guys, than Lester Bangs. And Lester Bangs was their biggest fan. And so he did speak highly of this album. They had another pretty big fan by the name of David Bowie during this time. And certainly his and Iggy Pop's origin story wields together from 1971 all the way through the late 70s. And we'll be touching on that in later Combing the Stacks. But this is their first album. We talked about how they were signed. And and that's kind of it, because we're going to talk about the Stooges again at different times, so I can get into some of the later stuff. They hadn't discovered heroin yet at this point, so they still are just sort of a young band with a lot of piss and vinegar, and just kind of, when you read about their stage shows, it seems like they're received by serious rock fans in the way that, like, Gwar mixed with, like Black Flag in the 80s, mixed with,
Alice in Chains. Not Alice in Chains, Alice Cooper.
No. Not even. Like, more just like something that just repulses you. You know what I mean? Just something that you're like, ugh, this is barely music, right?
Gwar is pretty repulsive, so.
It's all shtick, right? And so while Iggy and the Stooges sound not a whole lot like Gwar, and certainly they're not doing the costumes, when you hear people talk about, oh, what a novelty act and stuff, there's a lot of that type of talk when you're reading the contemporary stuff of the Stooges in terms of how they were received. I mean, the fact that Iggy was spreading peanut butter all over himself and hamburger meat probably also was a little bit over the top. So that's an overview of the Stooges. Enough about that, because I don't think this segment's going to be about bio, because there's plenty to talk about in the bio I can weave in. Josh, Stooges, what were your thoughts?
The future is the Stooges. Is what I would say if I was in 1969 seeing them live.
There you go.
This album was great. Now, is it a perfect album? No, I have some issues with it, but the sound is awesome. It seems, it's like you said in the intro, it's unlike anything we've listened to this far, and I can't even think of anything that's equivalent at this time period that sounds like the Stooges does. They are
only really MC5, I'd say, in terms of stuff we've covered.
They're like proto-punk, proto-metal. I got shades of Black Sabbath when I was listening to them. I just love the guitars. I love the energy and the mood that this album brings. It's just like, it blows me over, especially thinking about it, in the context of all the other albums that we talked about in the 60s and just the 60s in general, which is something I've never, placed it in on a timeline as to when it was released. So those are my initial thoughts. Matt, do you want to jump in here while I think of something else?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with much of what you just said. This is a great album, and I'm thinking garage rock. I'm hearing the garage rock, more. It's certainly punk, and but I just hear just like a raw energy here. I like the lo-fi production kind of quality. I could see how at the time that this came out that would be off-putting, because certainly there weren't a whole lot of acts with this type of sound. Probably, if anything, they were, acts were getting much more into the production of aspect of music, and the whole hippie counterculture thing I guess it was kind of coming towards an end, but I think that the music was still, what a lot of people were trying to do was probably geared more towards, lush harmonies, lush production. And this is certainly not that. And there's great riffs in here. It's a very simple type of music that they're playing, but it just shows that it doesn't have to be complicated to be good. It's just visceral. It's dirty. It's sludgy. And it's just a cool ass record. I would agree. I have some issues with it. Particularly the third track, "We Will Fall," which sounds nothing like the rest of the album. It's oddly, I think it's oddly placed in the record. It's the third track, and I believe the first side of the record is 3 songs, and this is the last one. It's over 10 minutes long, and it sounds like it's just this psychedelic kind of sound that's kind of cool, actually. It's just too long. It doesn't give you much variation. It doesn't build. It doesn't add a whole lot. It's essentially, you listen to the first 2 minutes, that's essentially what you're getting throughout the rest of the song. And it's just a bit much. It just goes on too long. If they cut that in half, and I'm sure maybe there's a reason, maybe John will enlighten us, there's a reason why, or some sort of feeling or emotion it was trying to go over. But Sherry was talking to me, and she goes, "This sounds like a Doors song. This sounds like something that the Morrison was trying to do with the Doors."
That's kind of what I think the idea was. Iggy was influenced, and this was their Doors homage. Yeah. It's terrible. Yeah, it's a wonderful album with one terrible song, bizarrely stuck in between, especially 3 tracks that have become very famous over time. So you get famous song, this disgrace of a song, another famous song, and then a bunch of deep cuts right off of it. So I can't disagree with that at all.
Yeah, it doesn't even change at all. Basically, it's like this droning meditation almost.
It's creepy. It's creepy too. It's like maybe it's a good Halloween. It's a good Ides of October song to listen to. It's not. It's too long. It's a couple minutes. I'm okay with it. I didn't hate it, but it's just I don't mind skipping over it after a couple minutes.
And spoiler alert: the remix of it on Spotify is just as bad, because I was curious to see what they would do with changing different stuff. Nope. Just it's Well, I don't want to stay there though, because this album's fucking fantastic. And first of all, it's the guitar is just like what you get with the Pixies or Husker Du. It's this discordant wave of sound type of guitar. It's that fuzz tone sound. Sonic Youth. There's a lot of bands in the 80s that love the Stooges, and you can listen to them immediately, the guitar fuzz sound. The Melvins is another band that. There's just a ton of bands that went for that sound, but those bands they went for the sound, but not the other part of it. The other part of it is that Iggy Pop and the sound of this is so fantastically sleazy. It's the sleaziest, guttural, visceral, in an era of supposedly free love and hippies and music expand. This speaks to me so much more in a visceral level than psychedelia does, which also was sort of freeing yourself, but it was almost like an overindulgent freeing yourself. This is the musical equivalent of someone walking up saying, "I have to take a piss," taking a piss on the stage, flipping you the middle finger. You know what I mean? Going up, buying your girlfriend a drink, and then you come up and then punching you in the face. It's what I love about Iggy Pop. He's just so fantastically sleazy, but in a way that you just are drawn into it, right? And the sound, the later in the album, songs like "Not Right" and "Little Doll" are just, the lyrics are just straight ahead, and the fuzz tone just washes over them to the point where everything kind of blends together, but in a good way, that you're getting barraged by this sound. And then, I Want to Be Your Dog is just, it's just, in modern context, it's a gross song, but I mean that positively. And so nothing sounded like this in the late 60s. And like when I say sleazy or grimy, it's in the same way that the Stones would go there in the early 70s, with the stuff that they were doing, and kind of that when they started taking on a little bit of that feel, and when they're at sort of their most raw and gritty, it's a little bit of that. I'm trying to even think of like other bands that give you sort of that feel, and there aren't many, and that's why Iggy Pop's Iggy Pop. You know what I mean? It carries all the way through the 70s. He's able to walk that line. But yeah, so good. Good.
And it's that quality that you can't quantify, because the lyrics aren't even anything to write home about on this album. They're basically like repeating most of the time, or it's kind of saying the same phrase in between music, and it doesn't matter, because I get that vibe that John is describing, and you just want to like vibe with this album. I can't like exactly say why it resonates with me so much, but it's great.
Well, and the lyric,
it's
also
like part of that whole.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it's part of that whole deal that it doesn't sound. There isn't that dated sound again. You know, this sounds like there's a lot of stuff on here that sounds like it could be done today. And I think that there's a lot of bands that, kind of came out of that garage rock, kind of sound that is, it hasn't really, a whole lot hasn't changed with this type of sound.
That's true.
But it's just so great, and, I guess, John, you mentioned the MC5. I like this way more than the MC5. This was a much more palatable listen for me.
I do too. And if you remember, I said in that episode, I said the Stooges take what the MC5 did and make it more not accessible, I'd say necessarily, but they take the formula and rein it in and create this.
Well, maybe in today's context, you could say that it was more accessible. But yeah, 1969, maybe not so much. People might hate this just as much as they would of the MC5.
Well, and I just want to point out the first 5 lyrics to I Want to Be Your Dog, because it's so perfect, like Iggy Pop lyrics. It's like, so messed up, I want you here, and in my room, I want you here, and now we're going to be face to face, and I'll lay you right down in my favorite place, and yeah, you know what that is. And I'm doing that no justice, because you have to hear Iggy Pop's urgency, so messed up, I want you here. It's like the way he carries out the stuff, and and then it goes into this frantic now I want to be your dog, and just you can hear it, you know what I mean? It's just it's like I could see how people would listen to it and just be repulsed, but
and shocked.
That's what's awesome. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
but his voice is great throughout this.
Oh,
it's
fantastic.
got a great, and you're right, it's not just the sound of it, it's like the urgency and the and it's genuine, you know what I mean? You're right, he's putting himself in it, and it makes it come off even that much better. But no, it is overall it's a great kick-ass listen. It isn't, and I'm wondering if, I was just going to say it's not that long, because again we're saying that a lot about a lot of these records. I'm wondering if even that We Will Fall track was maybe excessively long, because it was like filler, maybe they didn't have more songs, or they just needed to drag it out.
Pretty sure it was Iggy Pop paying homage to Jim Morrison.
Yeah,
that comes up quite a bit. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did Iggy or the band talk about their musical influences at all? Do you know where they were drawing from?
Iggy Pop is on record as saying that part of what he wanted to do, or Iggy Stooge at this point, I guess, was at this point he kind of wanted to be unmoored from influences. So he was kind of going for the same thing that the krautrock people went for a little bit later. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably why he ended up in the same circles as also people like Brian Eno, and those folks that were trying to make sort of that ambient music that didn't also come from the Western tradition. And one thing you hear a lot about this is one of the earliest examples of an album that doesn't come from the blues, R&B blues, American tradition. And I would agree with that. I mean, they're doing something that deconstructs that along the way. Not in the way that ambient music did, or that krautrock did, or stuff that also tried to go that route, but it doesn't there's no tradition to fall back on, and Iggy Pop was pretty clear about that being one of the things he was hoping to do. Yep.
I see most of that. I did hear a couple of tracks, 1969 and Little Doll. They do have that Bo Diddley beat thing going on. You know, there is that
they do.
Bo
Yep.
Diddley
And
sound. So I wouldn't say it's totally divorced from blues. I see what you're saying, because it's definitely a different sound in a lot of ways, but there are
I didn't say they succeeded. They were trying to trying to go in that. Yeah,
it's got to be hard to do that, though. If you're doing rock and roll and like trying to be totally absent of the blues, does it cease to be rock and roll at that point? But I would say that it is much different, and in a lot of ways, you know, they were the real trailblazers of that type of punk and garage rock sound, you know.
Well, and metal too, because metal doesn't really come from, I mean, I think people think metal does because of like Led Zeppelin, but it kind of comes down to what your view of Led Zeppelin is. Like, is Led Zeppelin a metal band, or are they just a rock band that plays heavier sometimes?
Yeah.
And, you know, for me, metal doesn't come necessarily as hardcore from that blues tradition either. It comes a lot more from what this is, like, you know, a heavier driving, accordant, you know, discordant sound, less moored to the traditional structures. Not unmoored, but less moored.
Yeah.
Well, it's like a lot of different. It's like a lot of different genre, a lot of music, right? It's just a progression. You know, it's a little of this, it's a little of that, until it becomes its own thing. So, but I see some roots here. You know, definitely. But
well, and we're gonna spend like the '80s. When I look at the charts, there's nothing but bands, you know, influenced by the Stooges on the 80s charts. I mean, like I said before, just off the top of my head, you can't listen to the Pixies or Husker Du or Sonic Youth or Jesus and Mary Chain or any of those bands doing sort of My Bloody Valentine. You know, those are all bands that have that fuzz tone sound and not always pleasant to listen to. And I think that's what Iggy is so interesting. He kind of brings like, you got to think to yourself, like, what would the Stooges sound like if they had a different front man? You know, and you can hear it sometimes because they get cut. The Stooges are covered by everybody. Like, it's almost comical, like, who covered them. And you know, Matt mentioned Uncle Tupelo, right? You know, a band that has country leanings. Nirvana. Kurt Cobain is well on the record saying that his favorite album of all time is Funhouse by the Stooges. Everybody at Guns N' Roses covered them. Multiple singer-songwriters covered them. The Sex Pistols covered them. You know what I'm saying? So they touched on everybody, you know, and so that speaks. And it's just funny because their records sold terribly in their moment, and they were kind of looked at as a novelty act, and their legend didn't start to grow until later revisionist stuff. And actually, you know, Iggy Pop would later release The Idiot and Lust for Life that Bowie was heavily involved in, and that sort of moved Iggy Pop to the mainstream, and people revisited it. But it really wasn't until the 80s and 90s, when these bands came along that listened to the Stooges a ton, that the Stooges started being talked about as a great rock and roll band, to the point where they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2010. So, well,
and that happens a lot, you know. I mean, I think it's hard in the moment to really understand the impact that an artist or a record can have. I mean, sometimes it might be easier to tell that than others. I think sometimes, you know, critics and fans reach for something that is not there. You know, it's almost like in today you're trying to say, like, oh, this is going to be an amazing album, it's going to have and then it flops, right? Or then it doesn't, then it just fades away. But you know, it does benefit from you know, having all these years, you know, decades later, of people being able to go back and see really how impactful it was, which was probably more difficult to tell at that time. But well, yeah, it's great. It's great.
I also think that the critics were so up the ass of psychedelic at the time that it's, and you know, psychedelic, what I found for me is it ages like a leisure suit, right? Whereas this ages beautifully.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I just think that it's like the critics at the time, I'm pretty sure, were like, oh, you know, psychedelic is the thing that's speaking to me, and this is sort of fringy. And it's just interesting how that plays itself out, right? Because time will ultimately, you know, answer the questions, like who stays relevant and then who falls into the background. But can I end this segment with one final quote, which I think perfectly encapsulates both Iggy Pop and the Stooges?
Yes. Sure.
So Iggy Pop, talking about Ron Ashton, the lead guitarist, said, I've never met a convincing musician who didn't look kind of ill and kind of dirty, and Ron had both of those things covered, and that was why he sought him out first for the Stooges, to go along with himself. And I thought, perfect. It's exactly, like, that quote encapsulates kind of, you know, the look, the sound, everything that they were going for, and it's perfect.
So he just basically saw Ashton like laying in a gutter, like vomiting.
Well, he saw him play, and then he looked at him and said, this guy has the look I'm going for. He looks like slightly, you know what I mean, like unkempt and dangerous, you know what I mean? And like I like this, you know what I mean? Like I don't want to just have these studio, you know, I'm not gonna have the Wrecking Crew playing behind me or like that, you know, that working musician type, you know what I mean? It's more.
I want to look like I live in an alley, sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Look, from the album cover, looks like he succeeded. They all kind of look like alley guys.
Yep.